Newsies. Pulitzer Strike, city-wide chaos.
Basically, whenever I go to the theatre and watch a show that is based on real events, I leave ready to dive headfirst into a research hole because I need to know everything about it, and I'm hoping there are others like me out there. Fingers crossed. If you're the same, this video is for you. We are kicking this brand new series off by talking about the true story behind one of my all-time favourite musicals, Cats. I'm kidding, obviously. It's Newsies. In its first iteration, Newsies was a Disney film released in 1992 starring Christian Bale, but it didn't really hit right with audiences, and it was quite a flop until it was tweaked a little bit and brought to the Broadway stage in March of 2012. But I've got questions. Who were the real Newsboys? What caused the strike? Where did they learn to do all that ballet? Obviously, being a Disney musical raises a lot of questions about how much the story has been Disney-fied to make it more appealing to mass audiences. So let's cut through all of that and find out what really happened during the Newsboys Strike of 1899. We all know there is no better place to tell a story than in a theatre, so I've somehow convinced them to let me in while they're setting up. Let's go.
In 1899, New York was growing. The city had officially expanded just a year earlier. The already high population was increasing, the class divides were becoming more stark than ever, and a lot of the famous Manhattan skyline that we now know was in its early planning stages. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Automobiles weren't widely used yet, and the subway didn't exist, so to get around, the upper classes would use horse-drawn carriages, and the lower classes would do most journeys on foot or by trolley. The trolleys were similar to trams that we have today, and there were stations dotted around the whole city, but one of the busiest stations was this one on Brooklyn Bridge. Only around 6% of the population graduated high school, with most children leaving before that to start work, and labour laws, even for kids, were near enough non-existent. Lots of kids worked in factories, sweeping rubbish, or, you guessed it, selling newspapers on the streets of New York. Some of these children were homeless and orphaned, but lots were children of poor parents or recent immigrants who depended on their children's wages to survive. Employers often preferred to hire children en masse because they were seen as more easily manageable, cheaper, and less likely to strike.
Well, little did they know.
Well, exactly. So a huge amount of lower class children would be working to earn money that was desperately needed for their families. And we can kind of see this in the show with the characters of Davy and Les, as they're working temporarily while their dad is off work from his factory job with an injury. For most of these kids who did have places to live, those houses were incredibly cramped, with multiple large families living in a small space that was designed for just one family. It was quite common back then for people to have 10 siblings or more as well, so there wasn't much space, and the limited money, food, and everything else was shared by more people than would realistically have been anything close to comfortable. So some of the children who lived in those extremely cramped conditions would also choose to work long hours or alongside school just to keep themselves out of the house for a bit. Apparently some newsboys were as young as 5 or 6 years old, but they ranged up to around 18 or slightly older. They were the primary way of distributing newspapers back then. As I said earlier, lots of people travelled on foot, so footfall was great in busy areas, and people always wanted to know what was going on in the world, just as we do now. The job was seen as one of the easier options for children at the time. They weren't usually loyal to one particular paper. That part kind of differs from what we see in the show. They would typically have several different papers to offer their customers, which they would buy from distributors for 50 cents per 100 papers. Newsboys would sell each one for a penny, meaning if they sold all their papers at full price, they would double their money. But if they didn't sell them by the end of the day, in the words of the show, they had to eat their losses. The distributors would not refund the cost of any unsold papers. So it was down to them to hedge their bets on the best story to shout about. They would get quite scrappy trying to be the first to get the papers off the wagon so they could then run away and find somewhere to skim through them, to pick their story and be the first one out on the street. It actually kind of encouraged sort of the earliest form of clickbait, promising that readers would find the bloody details of a massacre inside when actually it was about a dead flock of pigeons, that kind of thing. They would have made really good YouTubers, basically. The job had a lot of positives. It gave the boys something useful to do and an opportunity to be loud and social, something they wouldn't have got in the classroom. Obviously, they were able to earn their own money, and pretty decent money by child labour standards if they were any good at it. They were independent with no one boss to answer to. They could pick their own hours and choose where they wanted to work. Some got a thrill out of chasing a sale and hoping for a big tip. They made friends with one another, often playing games. The ones who sold near Times Square Station would apparently kick a can around while they waited for the latest editions to be delivered. Back then, children did spend most of their time on the streets anyway. The living conditions were cramped, like we said earlier, and parents would kind of leave their kids to their own devices, allowing them to feel as if they were living in a whole separate world run by children. I read a quote in the book Children of the City, which says, "The street made the children, while the children made the street." They were out leading their own independent lives, figuring out their own principles, and building a huge network of other kids doing the same. On the other hand, the job had its challenges. Aside from the obvious one being, some of them working while they should have been in primary school, they had to make a lot of big decisions for themselves. Working out how many papers they should buy that day before they'd really even had a chance to see the headlines. If they didn't buy enough, they might lose some of their regular customers, but if they bought too many, they'd eat into their profits. There were a lot of factors outside of their control which might impact their ability to sell. The weather, the day of the week, the sports scores, and the stories themselves. Their success could really fluctuate, so it wasn't a very stable income for them. They did start to get a bit of a reputation for making provocative stories up to sell more, but can you blame them? Being a newsboy was like putting on a performance every day. Imagine that, it must be so hard. They'd have to choose their selling tactic. Some of them would go for a more aggressive salesman approach. Some would play on the sympathy of their customers. And, as we see in Newsies, others would use their youth and cuteness to their advantage. They'd often have side hustles too, selling things like chewing gum, sweets, pencils and handkerchiefs along with their papers for a little bit of an upsell.
Undeniably, the Newsboys had power and agency. They'd previously affected elections by refusing to distribute newspapers that backed certain candidates, and they had striked before. Strikes were pretty common in a lot of industries. In terms of public perception, people complained about how loud the Newsboys were, and they were kind of seen as a bit of a nuisance in general, so the police were often looking for reasons to arrest them. Sometimes they were arrested for selling papers, which wasn't a crime. Other common reasons for arrest included begging, bonfires, playing football, loitering. You get the gist. It literally seems like the police were writing down whatever the boys happened to be doing when they found them rather than an actual reason for arrest. We kind of get that impression from the character of Snyder and the refuge in the show. And refuges like that did exist.
When they first opened, refuge houses were praised because they offered an alternative to adult prison and gave kids an opportunity to learn from their mistakes. But as time went on and more refuges opened, the conditions got worse and they began to resemble more of what we see in the show, with children inside being neglected and treated really poorly. Equally, the street kids did cause a lot of disruption for the police, like theft and vandalism, so there was quite a rivalry between the Newsboys and the law. Some adults really took it upon themselves to reform the Newsboys because the job was so closely associated to crime in their minds. They thought they were learning bad morals with all the exaggerating and lying about the headlines. In the show, Davy says, "Our father taught us not to lie," and Jack replies, "Yeah, well, mine taught me not to starve." And that was basically the debate of the time. It was quite a moral panic.
You just made that up. I did not. I said he heard it right here, and he did.
Studies were conducted in jails and houses of refuge where they noticed that a lot of boys in those places did sell papers. So that made them think that there must be a correlation between the two, but what they failed to understand, or maybe chose to ignore, is the fact that nearly all the boys sold papers on the street at some point, so wherever they looked, there was likely to be a high number of ex-newsies.
We kind of see this attitude of looking down on the Newsboys through Davy. Him and Les obviously come from a family where there's at least enough money to have a roof over their heads, put food on the table, and usually send the boys to school.
Davy is at first quite often shocked or disgusted by the Newsboys' behaviour when he first shows up, which is an attitude that he probably would have picked up from the adults around him. The reformers also took issue with children having enough autonomy and financial independence to decide where to spend their own money. They really looked down on the Newsboys for choosing to buy things like
cigars and food which they considered to be a luxury.
I find this debate quite interesting. On one hand, I firmly believe that these kids shouldn't have had to work from such a young age and that having that kind of responsibility must have forced them to grow up really fast.
They were being exploited
as cheap workers and taken advantage of because of their childlike naivety and willingness to work long hours. On the other hand, they were making the best of the options that were available to them. Some of them did enjoy the job and they were good at it, so surely they should be able to reap the benefits of their own hard work and not have anyone telling them how they should be spending their own earnings. Anyway, because of the moral panic, Newsboys' lodging houses opened. They offered a place to stay for the newsboys who didn't have homes or families, and even offered scheduled activities like lectures and games nights. Some of these, I think, were run by religious organisations, and obviously we see the nuns briefly at the beginning of the show, so that's probably where the inspiration to include them came from. That, and they just needed to give the women in the cast some airtime.
This would be a good time to shut up.
Although, actually, the current London production gives the women their moment much better than the previous Broadway one. Speaking of women, actually, there were some female newsies too, but they were kind of rare, mostly because of cultural factors. It would have been looked down upon for young girls to be brash and loud, and unfortunately, I assume, more dangerous for them to be out on the streets left to their own devices. There was quite a strong sense of camaraderie among the newsboys. Street gangs were very prevalent and mostly based purely on where they lived and absolutely nothing else, and they would sometimes get quite violent, but even those rivalries were forgotten the second the police showed up. Rival gangs would warn each other if police were in the area, and they would really team up together against law enforcement. The Newsies characters we know and love, Jack Kelly, Crutchy, Davy, Les, and the other newsboys, I hate to break it to you, but they didn't really exist. Actually, pretty much all of the characters in the show are made up for the sake of neat storytelling, but they did take inspiration from the real people, so let's meet some of the real-life newsboys. Here they are. Kid Blink, whose real name was Louis Belletti, was the inspiration for Jack Kelly. He was around 18 at the time of the strike, so one of the older newsboys, and lived in one of the cramped tenement flats on Park Row with his Italian immigrant family. Obviously, in the show, Jack is seen as quite a leader, and while Kid Blink did have a lot of the same qualities as Jack, in real life it was definitely more of a shared effort amongst a group of leaders. He had a small frame, bright red hair, spoke with a heavy New York accent. He got his name because he only had one working eye, and the other was covered by an eye patch. Dave Simons, or Simmons in some sources, was another boy amongst the strike leaders. He was around the same age as Jack and was a Jewish boxing champion. Random.
So random.
The newspapers loved it though. Another union member walked with a crutch after polio left him with one working leg. As we know from Kid Blink's nickname, the boys like to call it as they saw it, so he went by the name of Crutch Morris. Obviously, I'm assuming the name was inspiration for the character of Crutchy, but similarly to Dave Simons, we don't really know much about the real-life Crutchy. Lots of other names in the show were taken from real-life newsboys too, like Racetrack Higgins, who got his nickname because he just loved being at the racetrack. Every quote I can find from him, he somehow manages to mention either horse racing or gambling. Spot Conlon, the leader of Brooklyn, did exist in real life. He was well respected, even feared, just like in the show.
And who wants Brooklyn? Oh, come on.
But I think he was less of a singular leader and more like one of a few leaders. It seems like they've kind of brought a few people together in the character to keep the story moving along. Now we know a little bit about the people selling the papers, but what about the people up above the streets of New York making them? During the turn of the century, newspapers were pretty much the only way to learn about the world and current events, so the people who held the key to the printing press held a lot of power. I'm going to introduce you to two of those people now. You'll probably recognise their names from the show if nothing else, but these two men and their rivalry is really key to this story. First up, we have Joseph Pulitzer. He was born to a Jewish family in Hungary and grew up with very little money. Once he was old enough, Joseph tried to enlist in several different European militaries, but was rejected before successfully being recruited for the American Civil War. Once he had relocated to the US and his active military service was over, he moved around a little bit, and after trying a few different jobs in a few different places, Pulitzer discovered that he had a talent for reporting. He was particularly good at human interest stories and seemed to really be able to tap into what people actually wanted to read about. Apparently, he worked up to 16-hour days and earned quite a reputation among philosophers and intellectuals in St. Louis, Missouri. Back then, newspapers were mostly for the rich. A local newspaper was on the brink of death, and with an ambitious nature and a love for journalism, Pulitzer decided to take a leap of faith and buy the paper. As in the business, not just a copy, obviously. The paper had a democratic political leaning, and Pulitzer was described as a champion of the common man. It was a huge success. Until. In October 1882, one of the politicians that the paper had spoken against turned up at the publication's offices armed with a gun in a fit of rage. The managing editor of Pulitzer's first paper shot the politician dead in self-defense. Pulitzer replaced the managing editor, but the incident caused permanent damage to his reputation in the area, so he took the money he had earned from the success of that paper and decided to find a new project. And where better to start fresh than in New York City? Pulitzer moved his family to Gramercy Park in New York, and he knew that he wanted to find his feet in New York news circulation. The sheer numbers excited him in terms of money and influence, and cracking New York journalism felt like a huge step up. So he was looking for the right opportunity. On May the 10th, 1883, he bought a struggling paper called the New York World. Pulitzer's strategy was to focus on sensational stories, crime, disaster, and scandal. Before long, the World's circulation had grown from just 15,000 to 600,000 readers per day, making it by far the most successful publication in the US at the time. In his first issue, he announced that he wanted the paper to be dedicated to the cause of the people, and the paper ran with a democratic leaning, just like his first one, regularly siding with strikers, fighting for fairer pay and better work conditions. 12 years after Pulitzer took over the World, which does sound slightly hyperbolic when I say it out loud, a rival paper which had at one point been owned by his brother also found itself under new ownership. William Randolph Hearst was a Harvard graduate who grew up in a very affluent family. He got his start in the publishing business when his father gave him control of a paper he owned, but he knew that having a successful New York publication was where the real power lied, and he wanted a piece of that. If it sounds like I'm making Hearst out to be entitled and power-hungry, I am. Maybe that's unfair, I don't know the guy, but from what I've read, he sounds like quite a nasty piece of work. But anyway, in 1895, he bought the New York Journal. In that moment, a fierce and often spiteful circulation war began between the two media moguls. For years, Pulitzer and Hearst went to great lengths in the name of competition to make the most money and sell the most papers, with both of them trying to hire the most talented journalists and cartoonists to make their paper more successful than their rivals. Actually, there was a lot that the two papers had in common. Both were left-wing politically, they were both pro-immigrant, and they both favoured shocking headlines featuring the likes of crime, corruption, sex, and scandal.
All of my favourite things.
Absolutely. Pulitzer was actually quite a bit older than Hearst. He took a lot longer, obviously, to get to that position of power, and at the time of the strike, he was 52 years old, while Hearst was just 36. Unfortunately, Pulitzer's health took a turn for the worst and forced him out of the World's head office, so he delegated the running of the newspaper, but still kept a watchful eye from home. The managing editor would write him daily memos with updates, which actually are really helpful in learning more about how the paper was being run, and we'll see some of those in a bit. In early 1898, both papers published stories about a US Navy ship which had exploded and sunk in Cuba, claiming that this had been an act of Spanish rebellion against America, killing over 250 people. It's still debated to this day whether the sinking was deliberate, but more likely accidental, but either way, Pulitzer and Hearst both knew that the story could sell a lot of papers. And they were right. The explosive story sparked a huge amount of interest amongst readers, and that only continued to grow as the story became a catalyst for the Spanish-American War. If you know anything about business, you'll know that demand has to be met with supply. To feed their hungry readers, Pulitzer and Hearst hired more journalists and illustrators and stationed some of them in the thick of the action in Cuba and the Philippines. Fantastic for filling the papers with the latest news, but not so good for their budgets. Trying to one-up each other forced them to push further than they probably would have done otherwise. A bit like when someone bids more than they can really afford to in an auction because they get too caught up on beating the other guy. Basically, in the early stages of the war, they both spent hundreds of thousands of dollars competing and found themselves in six-figure deficits. Silly boys. Pulitzer had a whole team of people working out how to make the money back, and somewhere amongst those meetings they had a conversation that will sound familiar to anyone who has watched the show. A potential solution was suggested that wouldn't affect readers so their circulation numbers wouldn't take a hit, but would fatten their bottom line. As always, when one of the men had the upper hand, it didn't take long for the other one to catch on, and when Hearst found out about the world's new pricing, the Journal quickly followed suit. Suddenly, both papers had upped their Newsboys price from 50 cents per 100 to 60 cents per 100. Apparently Pulitzer was actually quite hesitant. Having come from humble beginnings himself, he didn't love the idea of making it the Newsboys' problem. I guess that's quite different from how it's portrayed in the show. Hearst, however, seemed to have no issue. I told you, his vibes are way off. Obviously, Hearst is named a few times in the show, but it's much more focused on Pulitzer and the world. But I think they probably combined the two characters just for the sake of having one super hateable villain in the way that Disney like to. Anyway, back to the point. Basically, they both thought, yeah, that's great. Now that our profit's been bolstered, we'll start to make the money back that we've lost. And actually, the Newsboys didn't seem to care that much. I can't find any evidence of resistance at first. Their circulation was way up from usual anyway. They were working up to 18-hour days just to meet demand. There was absolutely no shortage of people looking to buy papers, so it seemed, to quote the show, like a compromise they could all live with. And that's the end of my video. They made the strike up. I'm kidding, obviously. Unexpectedly, the war ended, very abruptly, just 10 weeks after it started. It's actually America's shortest war ever, which is great, war is bad, but Pulitzer and Hearst didn't think so. After the war ended, news became kind of sluggish. It was lacking a lot of the gore that the readers had become used to, and the Newsboys began to feel the impact of that 10 cents per 100 increase. By spring and summer of 1899, the war had been over for nearly a year, and it's likely that while the Newsboys gathered waiting for their papers or over dinner at the lodging house, they were talking amongst themselves, saying, yeah, about that price increase. Oh, for this next bit, let's do a quick location change. At 6 a.m. on the 18th of July 1899, a horse-drawn paper wagon arrived in Long Island City in Queens, ready to distribute the morning newspapers to the newspaper boys as usual. But the Newsboys had discovered that the distribution cart driver had been cheating them by charging the higher rate for papers which hadn't put their prices up, as well as for the World and the Journal, who were still selling at the wartime price of 60 cents per 100, and they weren't going to let him get away with it. Led by Kid Blink, the boys tipped over the cart, stole the papers and ran to Queensbridge Park, where they threw them over a low wall and into the East River. Reeling with adrenaline from the confrontation, they decided to take a stand. They gave notice to their supply men that they would no longer be buying Hearst or Pulitzer papers until there was a price rollback to bring them back in line with the other newspapers and with pre-war pricing. The news travelled fast from Long Island City, and by the next day, the newspaper boys of Manhattan had decided to get in on the strike action. One of the newsboys, Morris Cohen, who sold around 300 copies of The World every day, called a meeting here in City Hall Park. The union was organised, and much like the show, a strike committee was elected, and they announced that they would strike the next day unless Pulitzer and Hearst agreed to roll back their prices. The trolleys and streetcars were also striking, so newsboys were sent on foot to spread the word to other newsies on 59th Street and in Harlem, Brooklyn, Long Island City and Jersey. They probably did take some inspiration from those trolley strikes because they'd been going on for years by this stage, but they also knew that the police would be busy with the striking adults and that they could likely take advantage of the lack of police presence on the Manhattan streets if they acted quickly. This street is Park Row, which used to be nicknamed Newspaper Row as most of the main New York newspapers had their offices here. On the 20th of July 1899, strike action began with hundreds of newsboys lining this street, carrying clubs, stones and placards with the intention of physically stopping the delivery wagons from leaving with the papers. They did fear the police and agreed that there would be no violence towards the police for the sake of their own safety, but when the police inevitably arrived, the newsies ran away to avoid arrest, so the distribution carts were able to leave as usual. But when the carts got to their destinations, they were met with more strike action. Some distribution carts were bombarded with stones or had their papers stolen and torn up. Hearst was reportedly furious from the offset, and Pulitzer later admitted that he did feel guilty, but that he didn't like their mob-like approach. Right here in Columbus Circle, a crowd of 400 to 500 newsboys had gathered with signs and banners reading things like "Please don't buy the World or the Journal, our cause is just, and help the newsboys." The boys tried to advance on the wagon, but they were held back by police. So instead, they formed a circle around the cart, stopping any newsboys who were trying to work through the strike and calling them scabs. In the Disney musical, we see Jack Kelly and co giving motivational speeches to the newsboys working through the strike and winning them round with moral superiority and a sprinkling of peer pressure. But in reality, most of the time that process was far more violent. They would maul and beat the scabs until they dropped their papers and then destroy those papers by tearing them up and stomping them into the mud. On the 21st of July, the first mention of the strike appeared in Pulitzer's daily memos from the managing editor of The World. He wrote that the paper had some trouble today through the strike on the part of the newsboys, and went on to say that the strike would probably be sporadic for some days, but assured Pulitzer that they had the situation well in hand. But just 24 hours later, the tone of those memos had completely changed. So it now reads, "The Newsboys Strike has grown into a menacing affair and it's proving a serious problem. Practically all the boys in New York and adjacent towns have quit selling." The boys returned to the wagons every day to throw stones and fruit and to steal the papers to stop them from being sold. But the real pressure started to build on Pulitzer and Hearst a few days into the strike. Circulation had been cut by 50% and advertisers weren't happy. They began to pull their advertisements from the papers, putting even more financial strain on them and undermining Hearst and Pulitzer's empire and reputation. Lots of other papers which hadn't raised their prices weren't affected by the strike, and in fact they had an absolute field day reporting on it, obviously. The Sun cheered the boys on and described the strike as a mock-epic struggle of dirty-faced Davids against the twin Goliaths, which I assume was used as inspiration for one of Katherine's lines in the musical. On the 23rd of July, the Sun reported on a small boy buying scab papers under the protection of a police officer. One of the striking newsboys stole the papers and ran away, being chased by the police, but that was all part of the plan. Some other newsboys attacked the boy and continued beating him until he agreed to strike with them. And then half an hour later, that same young boy was seen leading a separate attack on another boy who was doing the same thing. So the strike was spreading fast, and the newsboys were gradually bringing the circulation of papers to a halt throughout the entire city. Public opinion was with the newsboys. One of Pulitzer's memos from the 24th of July reads, "The people seem to be against us. They are encouraging the boys and tipping them, and where they're not doing that, they are refraining from buying the papers for fear of having them snatched from their hands." Another paper labelled Pulitzer a traitor to the children of America, and heaps of angry letters from members of the public were arriving at the newspaper offices. The World and the Journal recruited homeless people to up their circulation, but in solidarity with the newspaper boys, they never even turned up to work. The Newsboys Union held a mass meeting at New Eving Hall on Broome Street, which doesn't seem to exist anymore, but that's beside the point. Around 5,000 newsboys attended from all around the city, so many that thousands of them were spilling out into the street. Some politicians showed their support and journalists came to cover the meeting, and the newsboys were well aware of how important the wording of these stories was to public opinion, so they struck up a good rapport with the writers and even asked them to amend the wording and not report on Newsies using colloquial phrases like theys and yous in case that would harm their chances of staying in good favour with the public. Some of the strike leaders spoke, pleading with the boys to keep the violence down, but urging them to hold firm in their strike efforts. Dave Simon, the president of the union, presented the boys with a set of resolutions to vote on, and Kid Blink addressed the crowd asking, "If they can't spare it, how can we? I'm trying to figure out how 10 cents on 100 papers can mean more to a millionaire than it does to newsboys, and I can't see it." In more of Pulitzer's memos, we can see that the papers really were in trouble. One reads, "The loss in circulation has been colossal. It is really remarkable the success that these boys have had." The press run had been reduced from 360,000 to just 125,000, and many of the papers which did make it to print were being destroyed before they could be sold. After 2 weeks of causing citywide chaos, Pulitzer and Hearst decided that they would have to concede to the striking children and give them a fair deal.
Like we see in the show, the price was rolled back by half to 55 cents per 100 papers, and the papers agreed to make an unprecedented change and for the first time ever buy back whatever newspapers the boys couldn't sell by the end of the day, which was undoubtedly a very successful outcome for the children of New York.
However, there is a lot that the show misses out, and not least because the strike lasted 2 weeks, but we need to fit it into 2 hours. And there are obviously some creative liberties being taken here and there, but here is a part of the story that is almost completely ignored. Just a few days before the end of the strike, Kid Blink and Dave Simons both actually stepped down from their leadership roles within the union after accusations began that they had been selling scab papers on the down low. On the 27th of July 1899, several New York newspapers reported that the pair had taken bribery money to betray their own strike and carry on selling. Some papers reported that they were each given $400, others said $200 and a new outfit, others said $1 a day and free papers, and some others said there was no money involved whatsoever, they just thought the strike was finished. I'm seeing some inconsistencies here, and in my opinion, none of that seems to add up. Just 3 days before, Kid Blink had given a speech saying, "William Randolph Hearst says he'll go out of business and close shop before he gives in to us. I guess that's what he'll have to do." And to me, that doesn't sound like the words of a boy who has lost faith in a cause or is about to betray it. After these accusations were made, Dave Simons apparently called the report a device of the enemy and said that it wasn't true. Basically, he suspected that the story had been made up and circulated to the newspapers by people working for the World and the Journal. The strike was in full swing by this point, and they were probably feeling the pressure to undermine the children. And they likely wanted to cause some division between the boys to weaken their resolve or distract them from the strike. Personally, I actually think it shows a lot of maturity and integrity that the boys chose to step down and cast their pride aside so as not to shift focus from the cause. But I think the musical wants us to see Jack as an unwavering hero, and I suppose because they have made him as a fictional character instead of calling him Kid Blink, they're not being dishonest in doing that. But it does make you wonder, or it makes me wonder at least, how they chose which bits to leave in the story and which bits to take out. What narrative were they pandering to? What's the point? And I think in the case of Newsies, they were particularly looking to tell a story of children rising up and a new generation taking control, which is summed up very well in one of Roosevelt's lines from the end of the show. He says, "Each generation must, at the height of its power, step aside and invite the young to share the day." And that same theme is so eloquently raised by Finch at another point in the show when he asks, "Why do old people talk?" It's about the cyclical nature of views and systems becoming outdated and needing to make way for the future. It reminds young people that their voice does matter, and even if they feel like they're not being heard just yet, to keep pushing and that their time will come. And that message of empowerment is one of my favourite things about the show, and I think it is the reason that it resonates with so many people. It seems to me that pretty much all of the plot points that were added were written with the intention of giving the children all of the victory. For example, the character of Katherine is completely fictional, and in the show it's Katherine's writing that propels the boys into public renown and makes them the kings of New York. In reality, of course, the news coverage of the strike did make all the difference. It was hugely important in swaying public opinion and making the public side with the Newsies, but as far as I can tell, all of those stories were written by grown-ups. Another example is that the end of the strike in the show comes about as a result of, first of all, the Brooklyn Newsies finally joining in with the strike, but also with all of the children of the New York media giants gathering together around an old printing press and creating the Newsies banner, a newspaper created entirely by children. But in truth, the Newsies banner never really existed, and as we've already discussed, it's quite likely that one of the key factors in bringing about the end of the strike was actually the advertisers pulling their support. It's no surprise that what was actually pulling the strings, a lot of it was about money. And there are a few other examples like that where key details have been changed or moved around to create this idea of a children's only victory within the show that I don't think is representative of real life. They even go so far as to say about a children's crusade where most of the children in the city stopped working in solidarity with the Newsboys, but I can't find any evidence that that happened in real life. Although there were lots of strikes going on around that time, and it is likely that a strike of this magnitude and with this success would have encouraged other exploited workers to fight for their own causes. To be honest, when I first scratched the surface and started researching this video, I felt kind of cheated. I felt like the musical wasn't very accurate at all to the actual historical events that it's based on. Yeah, I felt disappointed by how much depth I felt had been left out. But having seen it again several times since my research began, I have now realised just how many Easter eggs about the historical events are actually woven into the lyrics in the book of the show in a way that doesn't distract from the story that they're trying to tell. But if you know more about everything that happened, they're really fun to point out. And now my opinion has changed almost completely. I find this story so interesting, if you haven't guessed, and I wish that we could have like a 5-hour extended version to pack in as much lore as possible. But realistically, I know that we can only ask the boys to do so many backflips before they get dizzy, and we have to draw a line somewhere. Speaking of drawing a line, I think it's time to cut myself off. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed to my channel. Although it's been a real labour of love and something I've wanted to make for years, it took a really long time to put together. So please, if you've enjoyed it, let me know, share it with your friends. I really appreciate all the support. Also, I'd love to hear if there are any other shows you'd like me to have a crack at in this new musical history series. That being said, I'm definitely not an expert or a historian. I've just done some pretty extensive research to answer all of my own questions and then put them all together here for you, to save you some time hopefully. But if you know something better than I do, please do correct me politely in the comments. I'm always up for learning more, and obviously this stuff happened a long time ago. I don't know how reliable my sources are. I've put a list of them in the description though, if you want to do any reading of your own. Thank you for listening and sticking it out to the end. If you're not ready to say goodbye just yet, there's another video on screen which I have a feeling you might like, but I've got a show to watch, so I'll catch you later. I actually can't believe Trig will let me film on stage. I could have literally cried. So the better this video does, the more likely I will be able to do more stuff like that. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and let me know which other shows you would like me to look into the history behind. I would love to make this a whole series. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you very soon.